Is it possible to achieve 80% comprehension in a foreign language after just 2 months of study? Well, to answer that question, first we need to determine what does 80% comprehension actually mean, right? So, if we're talking about 80% of the entire language, like 80% of all words contained in that language, then no, that is not anywhere near possible. For reference, I'm a fluent native English speaker. I don't even know anywhere close to 80% of all words in the English language, right? Let alone Vietnamese, Japanese, whatever. So, achieving 80% comprehension of an entire language in 2 months is completely out of the question. It's probably not even possible in 5 years, right? Even if you dedicated yourself to that pursuit. So, no, 80% of the entire language in 2 months is not possible. The more realistic question would be, what about 80% of what a native speaker would know? And even in that instance, it's nowhere close to possible, right? In 2 months, not even close. 2 years would be a much more realistic timeline. And actually, that's how long it took me to reach 80% of what a native would be comprehending in Vietnamese. So that's how long it took me, 2 years to reach that point. And I would say 80% of a native's comprehension in 2 years is actually pretty good speed, right? And so going back to the initial claim of 2 months, that is completely impossible and a ridiculous thing to even say. And there's a lot of people online that will tell you that you can get fluent in a language in 3 months. And anybody who tells you that is not your friend, right? So that is a completely outlandish claim. Now, what about 80% of one single episode of native content? Is it possible to achieve 80% comprehension of a specific episode in just 2 months? The answer to that is yes, right? That is possible. That is very realistic. There's a lot of software that exists online for learning language. The one that I use personally is called Migaku. And what happens is it takes every single word that's spoken in the TV show that you're watching, and you can mark it as either known, unknown, or ignored, right? So, like, for example, when somebody grunts, then there's like a sound effect in the language. You would press ignore on that, right? For somebody's name, you would press ignore on that because it's not like a known word in the language. But for like a regular vocabulary word that you know, you'd press known, and that you don't know, you'd press unknown. And it will give you the percentage of words in that particular episode that you understood. And on one particular episode that I was watching, I had achieved 80% comprehension, which means that only 20% of the words that were in that episode I did not know, right? And so, under this context, yes, it is very possible. In fact, I did it myself. But you have to keep in mind that this is just one episode of one show. In fact, just yesterday, I was reading a news article in Japanese to try to kind of just test my limits and see where I'm at. And my comprehension of that news article was at 23%, which is horrendously low and basically made reading it impossible, right? And so there's two reasons why you experience such a huge gap in comprehension between two different types of content. Number one is the domains, right? Whatever you're most familiar with, whatever domain of language that you're most familiar with, your comprehension of that is going to be substantially higher, right? And so reading the news in Japanese is something I've only done in my life very recently, and I haven't spent too much time doing it. And so therefore, I'm going to be worse at it. Whereas watching like shonen fighting anime, I literally had 3 years of my life where I watched almost exclusively that for like hours a day on end, right? And so because I'm so much more familiar with that domain, even though I didn't like study language during that time, just my level of familiarity with the tropes and the types of things that are said and everything like that made comprehending that so much easier. So, for example, if you're studying French and you're reading a meteorology textbook and you've never studied meteorology in your life, your comprehension of that is going to be horrendous, right? Whereas if you're studying French and you are a PhD in meteorology and you decide to read meteorology in French, even though you've never actually studied it in French, but because you're so familiar with the material covered, your comprehension is just going to be higher because you can kind of predict the types of things that are going to be saying, which makes it more comprehensible, if that makes sense. And so you're going to understand more words given the fact that you know more of the context behind it, all right? The second thing besides domains that contribute to making content more or less comprehensible is just like the general level of how difficult something is, how much variety of vocabulary is in there, and how much specialized vocabulary is in there. So going back to my Japanese example, the particular episode that I watched was just a lot of fighting scenes, right? It was almost the entire episode was fighting. So most of the dialogue was along the lines of, he's over there, he's behind you, he's very fast, he's going that way, things like that. Very simple phrases that people would say in that kind of situation. And a lot of the grunting and stuff that typically accompanies a fight was just an ignore press button, right? And so the news article just had a much greater variety of the types of words it was using. And then the actual words that it was using as well were just a lot more specialized to be like speaking about a particular like political tension that was going on, right? And so that's how this phenomena is possible in the first place, where you can have 80% comprehension of a specific episode, but in reality, you're still a beginner in the language, right? And so The real reason why I'm making this video is kind of twofold. Number one, I want to set realistic expectations for people who are learning languages because a lot of people may think they may get discouraged that in certain domains of language they have 80% comprehension, whereas in others they don't understand anything, and they might think that they're bad because of it, right? But that's not the case. That's a completely normal thing, and in fact, it's actually a good thing that you're really able to hone in and get really competent in one specific domain before branching out to others. I think that's a great way to go about studying the language. But what truly prompted me to make this video was that I wanted to respond to a lot of the comments I was getting in a video that I uploaded a week ago. And that video was titled something along the lines of how I achieved 80% comprehension in Japanese in just 2 months. Now, I did word that title in a little bit of an ambiguous way because I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel. And I know that if I word a title in a more ambiguous way, then people would click it, right? And so that worked. That video got about 5,000 views. But then the problem was that people, even though I immediately clarified the context in which I was talking about, a lot of people watching that video didn't really understand what I was trying to say. And so that's why I wanted to kind of just clarify my stance on this topic, just to make sure that people don't think that I'm like dumb enough to believe that you could actually learn 80% of an entire language in 2 months or anything like that. So in conclusion, to learn 80% of what a native knows in any language in 2 months is simply not possible. However, achieving 80% comprehension in a single episode is definitely possible. In fact, since I made that last video, I've done it again. There was another episode that I watched with 80% comprehension. So if you want to know how I'm able to achieve these kind of results in Japanese in a very specific domain, and you also want to know the context which kind of inspired this video, the video on your screen right now explains exactly how I did the whole thing in Japanese. All right, thank you.